Imagine a world holding its breath. A single event, a miscalculation in the tense waters of the South China Sea, could ignite a firestorm. This isn't a scene from a movie, it is a stark reality we face today. The question is no longer if it could happen but how it might unfold. What would a war between the world's two most powerful nations, the United States and China, actually look like? The answer is complex, terrifying, and would reshape the lives of every person on this planet. It begins with a single irreversible action, an incident that diplomacy cannot contain, pushing Titans toward a collision course that has been decades in the making. The tensions are not new. They have been simmering for years, fueled by deep-seated disagreements. For the United States, the core issues often revolve around maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific region. This means ensuring international waters remain open for trade and navigation, a principle Washington sees as fundamental to global stability. There are also profound concerns over trade imbalances, intellectual property theft, and human rights. For America and its allies, the rise of an authoritarian power challenging the post-World War II order is a direct threat to their values and their security, a challenge that cannot be ignored indefinitely. From Beijing's perspective, the narrative is entirely different. The primary goal is national rejuvenation and the end of what it calls the century of humiliation. This involves securing what it considers its sovereign territory, most notably Taiwan, which it views as a renegade province. The presence of the U.S. military in the region is seen not as a stabilizing force but as an act of containment, a deliberate effort to curb China's rightful ascent as a global power. For China, asserting control over the South China Sea and unifying with Taiwan are non-negotiable matters of national pride and strategic necessity, steps toward reclaiming its historical position at the center of the world. So, how does the first shot get fired? It could be an accident, a Chinese jet and a U.S. surveillance plane colliding over international waters. It could be a deliberate escalation, a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan daring the United States to intervene. It could even be a misunderstanding, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure that is misinterpreted as an act of war. The triggers are numerous and frighteningly plausible. In this high-stakes environment where nationalism runs high and communication lines are fragile, a small spark could easily be fanned into an uncontrollable blaze, plunging the world into a conflict it is not prepared for. A war in the 21st century would look nothing like the conflicts of the past. The United States would likely aim to cripple China's ability to project power beyond its shores. The strategy would involve using its powerful Navy and Air Force, along with its network of military bases across the Pacific, to create a blockade. The goal would be to cut off China's access to vital resources like oil, and to disrupt its massive export economy. America's technological edge, particularly in stealth aircraft, submarines, and carrier strike groups, would be its greatest asset. The objective wouldn't be to invade the mainland, but to apply overwhelming economic and military pressure until Beijing is forced to back down. China, on the other hand, would fight a defensive war on its home turf, an approach it has perfected. Its strategy, often called anti-access/area denial, or a 2/AD, is designed specifically to counter American military strengths. This involves deploying a massive arsenal of advanced missiles, sometimes called carrier killers, capable of targeting U.S. ships and bases from hundreds of miles away. China would also leverage its huge submarine fleet to harass naval forces and disrupt supply lines. The goal is to make the cost of operating near China's coast so high, so dangerous, that the United States would be unable to sustain a long-term fight, effectively pushing its forces out of the Western Pacific. The battlefield would not be limited to land, sea, and air. The first true world war of the digital age would be fought silently in cyberspace. Both nations possess formidable cyber warfare capabilities. Imagine a conflict where power grids are shut down, financial markets are thrown into chaos, and communication networks collapse. This digital war would target not just military command and control systems, but the essential services that civilians rely on every day. A successful cyber attack could be as devastating as a physical bombing, causing widespread panic and societal breakdown without a single shot being fired, making everyone a potential target. Furthermore, space would become a critical domain of conflict. Modern militaries are completely dependent on satellites for communication, navigation, like GPS, and intelligence gathering. Both the US and China have developed anti-satellite weapons capable of destroying these vital assets in orbit. A war in space would be a blinding attack, aimed at leaving the enemy deaf, dumb, and lost. The destruction of satellites would not only cripple military operations, but would also have a catastrophic impact on civilian life, disrupting everything from weather forecasting and television broadcasts to global banking and internet access, creating a new and dangerous frontier for warfare. A conflict between America and China would not remain a two-player game for long. The world would be forced to choose sides, leading to a global realignment of alliances. Nations in the Indo-Pacific would be on the front lines. Key U.S. allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines would likely be drawn in due to mutual defense treaties and their strategic proximity to the conflict. Their bases would be essential for U.S. operations, but this would also make them direct targets for Chinese retaliation. The decisions made in Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila could determine the entire course of the war, turning regional partners into active combatants. Other global powers would face immense pressure. European nations, bound to the U.S. through NATO, would have to decide whether a conflict in the Pacific constitutes an attack on all. While some might offer diplomatic and economic support, the appetite for direct military involvement would be low, potentially creating deep fractures within the Western alliance. Meanwhile, countries like Russia might see the conflict as a golden opportunity to advance their own interests, perhaps by supporting China to weaken the United States, or by making aggressive moves elsewhere, while the world's attention is diverted to Asia. The war would create a chaotic, multipolar world of shifting loyalties. The economic fallout would be immediate and catastrophic, triggering a global depression far worse than anything seen in modern history. The US and China are the two largest economies, deeply intertwined through supply chains. A war would sever these connections overnight. Factories that rely on Chinese components would shut down, shelves in American stores would go bare. The flow of everything from iPhones and pharmaceuticals to furniture and clothing would cease. This disruption would cause mass unemployment, skyrocketing inflation, and financial market collapse not just in the warring nations, but across the entire globe, as every economy is connected to this central artery of trade. For people everywhere, daily life would be profoundly altered. The cost of food and fuel would soar as global shipping lanes become war zones. Access to technology and medicine, much of which is produced in or sourced from China, would be severely restricted. International travel would become dangerous and limited. The sense of global community fostered over decades would evaporate, replaced by suspicion and nationalism. The conflict would dominate every news broadcast, creating a constant state of anxiety and fear. The safety and predictability that underpin modern society would crumble, leaving a world that is poorer, more dangerous, and deeply divided. The true cost of such a war would be measured not just in military losses, but in human suffering on an unimaginable scale. Beyond the soldiers, sailors, and pilots directly involved in combat, millions of civilians would become casualties. In a modern war, the distinction between military and civilian targets becomes blurred, especially with the use of long-range missiles and cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. Cities could face blockades, leading to shortages of food, water, and medicine. The humanitarian crisis would be staggering, creating waves of refugees and internally displaced people with nowhere to go, their lives shattered by a conflict they did not choose. The psychological toll on humanity would be immense and long-lasting. A war between superpowers would extinguish the hope for a peaceful, cooperative future that has guided international relations for generations. It would normalize aggression on a global scale, teaching a future generation that might is right. The constant fear, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of homes and communities would leave deep, collective trauma. Trust between nations, already fragile, would be completely destroyed, making future cooperation on shared challenges like climate change, pandemics, and poverty nearly impossible. The world would become a more cynical and fearful place. Even if the conflict did not escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, a terrifying possibility that would always loom in the background, the environmental devastation would be severe. Sunken warships would leak oil and other toxic materials into the oceans for decades, destroying marine ecosystems. The carbon footprint of military operations, from flying jets to powering naval fleets, is enormous and would accelerate climate change. The focus on war would divert all resources and political will away from environmental protection, setting back progress by decades and causing irreversible harm to the planet that all of humanity shares, regardless of nationality. Ultimately, This thought experiment reveals a profound truth. In a war between the United States and China, there would be no real winner. The destruction would be so vast, the economic collapse so complete, and the human cost so high that any declaration of victory would be meaningless, proclaimed over a world in ruins. It serves as a stark reminder of the immense value of peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. Preventing such a conflict is the single greatest challenge of our time. The responsibility to find common ground, to de-escalate tensions, and to build bridges instead of walls rests not just with leaders, but with every global citizen who understands that our shared future depends on it.